Clara heard her mother's voice, through the kitchen wall. Clear as a bell and twice as cold. Josephine will be the one they remember. May will be the one they love. And a pause. A small, tired sigh. Clara will be the one they need. That's enough for a woman like her. Clara stood on the other side of that wall, with a pot of boiling water in both hands, and her sister's laughter threading through the gap under the door like smoke. And she did not move. She did not make a sound. She just stood there and let those words land on her. One by one, like stones dropped into still water. That's enough for a woman like her. She turned back to the stove. She kept working. That was what Clara Whitman did. She always kept working. If this story already feels like something you've lived, please subscribe right now and hit that bell so you never miss a single chapter. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or state you're watching from. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The Whitman boarding house sat at the far end of Willow Creek's Main Street. And it had been running for 22 years without stopping once. The same way a river runs, not because anyone tells it to, but because stopping is simply not something it knows how to do. Clara Whitman was the river. She was 29 years old, and she had been keeping that house alive since she was 14. When her father got sick the first time, and someone had to step forward and nobody else did. She stepped forward. It became permanent the way temporary things always do when nobody comes to relieve you quietly. Without ceremony, without anyone ever sitting down to decide it was fair. It simply became the shape of her life. Up at 4:50 in the morning. Fire lit, water heated, biscuits pressed and in the pan before the first guest stirred upstairs. Coffee on. Table set 6 plates, 6 cups, 6 sets of silverware laid straight. Because her father had said even a modest house could have dignity, and she had never stopped believing that even after everything else had worn thin. 6 plates. Never 7. She ate standing at the kitchen counter. After everyone else had pushed back from the table and gone about their days. With whatever was left in the pot and the particular specific silence of a room that had been full of people 30 minutes ago and now contained only her. She told herself she preferred it that way. She had told herself that so many times she could no longer locate the original truth underneath. Her mother, Edith Whitman, was a woman who had once been beautiful and had organized her entire understanding of the world around that fact. Beauty was currency. Beauty opened doors. Beauty was what a woman traded on. And a woman who had it was fortunate, and a woman who didn't had better find another way to make herself useful. Clara had been useful since she was 14. Her sister Josephine was 24 and had their father's dark hair and their mother's cheekbones and the kind of easy, unthinking confidence that comes from a lifetime of walking into rooms and being looked at. She was not cruel. She was simply accustomed to being chosen. The way people who are always warm are simply accustomed to standing near the fire. May was 21 and soft and genuinely sweet in a way that was entirely her own. But sweetness, Clara had observed, did not require getting up before 5 o'clock. May's sweetness expressed itself in small kindnesses offered from comfortable chairs. And nobody seemed to think this was insufficient. Clara did not resent her sisters. She had examined this question carefully over the years. The way you press on a bruise to understand where it actually hurts. And what she found underneath the exhaustion and the invisibility was not resentment. It was something quieter and more bewildering than that. It was grief. Grief for the version of herself she sometimes caught glimpses of in the space between one task and the next, the girl who had once wanted to learn to read music properly. Who had found a book at Hatcher's General Store when she was 16 and taught herself enough to know she wanted to know more. Until her mother needed the shelf space and the book was gone and the wanting had to go somewhere, it wouldn't cause trouble. She'd put it in the same place. She put everything she couldn't afford to feel. Somewhere deep, somewhere quiet, somewhere it couldn't slow her hands down. The morning Everett Callahan arrived in Willow Creek was a Tuesday in the last week of June. and Clara almost missed it entirely because she was behind the boarding house wrestling with a stuck drain cover when she heard the wagon come down the main street. She didn't look up. Wagons came through. Riders came through. Men with money and men without it, and men who thought they were one and turned out to be the other. They all came through Willow Creek eventually, and they all eventually left. And the boarding house kept running regardless. She got the drain cover loose, dealt with what was underneath it, not a task for the faint of heart, and not one anyone else had offered to handle, and was wiping her hands on a rag when she came back through the kitchen door and found her mother in the front room with all her social brightness turned up to full. Clara stopped in the kitchen doorway. Standing in the front room, turning his hat slowly in both hands, was a man she had never seen before. Tall, not flashy handsome, not the kind of man who walked into a room expecting to be noticed, but there was something about the way he stood that was harder to look away from than handsomeness usually managed. A quietness, a settledness, like a man who had figured out where his weight belonged and had put it there. Brown hair, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a few days. Eyes that were some particular shade of a gray that Clara's mind reached for a description of, and then gave up on something between storm clouds and creek water after rain. Good boots worn but cared for, a dark coat trail dusted but well cut. The clothes of a man who had things to do and did not require an audience for the doing of them. "We have a south-facing room on the second floor," Edith was saying. In her warmest register, "Good light in the mornings. My daughters will see to anything you need. I appreciate that. Ma'am, I won't require much. I'm here until my property arrangements get settled." Edith's eyebrows rose. "You've purchased property nearby?" "The old Hadley land." "Outside town," he nodded. "Just signed the papers last week." Well, Edith's smile widened considerably. The Hadley property was not small. "Welcome to Willow Creek." "Mr. Callahan, Everett Callahan." It was precisely at that moment that Everett Callahan's eyes moved naturally. Without calculation, the way eyes move when they become aware of a presence, and found Clara standing in the kitchen doorway in her gray-washed apron, with a dirty rag in her hands and grime from the drain still on her forearms. She prepared for his gaze to slide past her. It didn't slide past her. He looked at her the way a person looks when they have actually seen something directly. Without hurry, without the faint glazing over that Clara had come to recognize as the standard response of people encountering her. Just looked, present, attentive, like she was worth the attention of a pair of eyes. Then he gave her a single small nod, unhurried, respectful. Like she was a person standing in a room and deserved to be acknowledged as one. Clara turned around and went back into the kitchen. She put the rag down on the counter. She stood there for a moment with her hands flat on the wood and her heart doing something unsteady that she told herself was the exertion of the drain work and absolutely nothing else. "Don't," she said to herself with considerable firmness. "Don't you dare." She had learned that lesson before. She was not willing to pay for it again. Josephine identified him as significant within approximately 40 minutes of his arrival, which was close to her personal best. She came down the stairs that first evening in her blue dress, her good one. The one she saved with a book in her hands she wasn't reading. And by the time Clara served supper, she had learned his full name, his approximate acreage, his origin point, and his marital status. All gathered, as far as Clara could tell, through the simple mechanism of being beautiful and asking questions in a tone that made men feel interesting for answering them. It was a genuine skill. Clara had never begrudged it. "He's very quiet," Josephine reported to May in the upstairs hallway that night, her voice carrying easily to the kitchen below, where Clara was still cleaning up. "Handsome, though," May said. "In a serious way. Ranchers get that way. Do you think he has money? He has land." "Which is better?" A pause. "He barely looked at me at supper." A silence. "He looked at Clara," May said quietly, like she was reporting something she wasn't sure how to classify. Another silence, longer. "He was probably just being polite," Josephine said finally. Clara in the kitchen below kept washing dishes. Her hands did not slow down. Her face did not change. But something in her chest did something small and stubborn that she decided. Firmly, he noticed things. That was what she could not account for. That was what kept refusing to stay in the box she tried to put it in. On the second morning, he came down to breakfast early before the miners. Before Mrs. Fogarty, before anyone in Clara was pouring coffee when he said, "Without looking up from the table, you were up before 5 again." She stopped pouring. "How would you know that?" she asked. He looked up then. "The bread. You can tell by the crust how long it's had to rest. And the biscuits that many, done right, take time." He looked at her steadily. "I'd guess 4:40. 4:50 at the latest." Clara stared at him. 4:47, as it happened. But she wasn't going to say that. "It's just the morning," she said, and moved to the next cup. "It's a long morning," he said. "It's the one I've got." She felt his eyes on her back all the way to the end of the table. She told herself it was nothing. She was running out of conviction. The fourth day he was there. Mrs. Fogarty almost ruined everything before it had properly started. It was breakfast. The table was full, both miners. Mrs. Fogarty, the land surveyor Pratt who chewed with his mouth open and asked questions nobody had answered. And Everett at the far end, quiet over his plate. Clara was moving around the table with the coffee pot. Mrs. Fogarty had a particular talent for speaking into conversational pauses in a way that sounded like observation, but functioned like a blade. She used it now. "You know," she said, to no one directly. In the tone of a woman sharing a reasonable thought. "I imagine it must be practical for a man setting up a new ranch to find a woman who truly knows how to manage a household." Nobody spoke. "Not every man thinks of it that way," Mrs. Fogarty continued, smoothing her napkin. "Most young men chase pretty faces. But a smart man," she paused meaningfully, "looks for a woman who can work." Clara was behind Everett. She kept her face still, kept moving, reached for his cup. She had long practice at making her face a surface that things slid off of. She heard his voice before she had processed that he was about to speak. Mrs. Fogarty, low, unhurried, carrying the specific weight of a man who does not raise his voice because he has never needed to. The table went Callahan. "Your biscuits are untouched." A pause. I was just about to. Miss Whitman was up before 5 o'clock this morning to make sure this table was right." His voice did not change in volume or temperature. It remained perfectly conversational, which somehow made it more effective. "Not less. She does that every morning. Has done, by my count, for a good many years." A pause. "I think a person who does that deserves to have her biscuits eaten while they're still warm." Dead silence. Then the sound of Mrs. Fogarty's fork making contact with her plate. "Of course," she said stiffly. The miners resumed eating. Pratt resumed chewing, though somewhat more quietly. The conversation, such as it had been, did not restart. Clara made it to the kitchen before her hands started shaking. She set the coffee pot down on the stove. She pressed both palms flat on the counter. She stood there with her eyes closed and breathed slowly through her nose and told herself this was not significant. Told herself a man defending the quality of breakfast biscuits was not the same as a man defending her. She almost believed it. She turned around to go back out, and Everett was standing in the kitchen doorway. She startled hard. "I didn't mean he started." "It's fine." She reached past him for the dish rag. "You didn't have to do that. I know. It'll make things strange." "She'll be difficult for the rest of the week." "Probably," he agreed. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe, arms crossed. In no apparent hurry to be anywhere else. "Does that bother you?" "That she'll be difficult?" Clara looked at him. "I've been managing difficult for 15 years, she said flatly. "One more week won't break me." Something moved in his expression. Not pity, she'd had enough of pity to recognize it at 50 paces. And this wasn't it. Something more like recognition. Like she'd said something he understood in his bones. "No," he said quietly. "I don't reckon it will." He pushed off the doorframe. Clara. Her given name spoken without ceremony, like he'd been using it for years. She went still. When I said what I said out there, it wasn't about the biscuits. He left the kitchen. She stood in the middle of it for a long time after. He found her behind the boarding house on the 5th afternoon. She was hanging laundry in the hot midday sun, moving through the rhythm of it pull. Shake, pin, move lost deep enough in the repetition that she didn't hear him come around the corner until he was already close. She turned fast. He stopped immediately, both hands visible. "Forgive me," I should have called out. Clara pressed a hand to her sternum where her heart had lurched. "It's all right." He was holding something. A small, loosely bundled bunch of wildflowers, the blue mountain kind that grew thick along the creek bank. Simple, not arranged into anything, just gathered. The way a person gathers something, because it's there, and they thought of someone. He held them out toward her. She looked at them, looked at him. Why? The question came out more direct than she intended. He seemed to consider it genuinely, rather than being thrown by it. "I came past the creek on my way in," he said. "I saw them." "I thought of you." "Yes." "Why?" she said again. Because the first answer hadn't actually answered the question. He looked at her steadily. "Because I've been in this house 5 days. And in 5 days I haven't seen one single person give you anything." The words landed quietly. The world went very still around them. Clara looked at the flowers. She had a list of things she could say. Reasonable things. Gracious things. She ran through them quickly in her mind and found that none of them would come out of her mouth correctly. Because her throat had closed in the way it does, when something has broken through a wall you didn't know was load-bearing. She blinked hard, looked up at the sky, pressed her lips together. "Miss Whitman." His voice was low. "Careful, I'm fine," she said. "I know you are. I just stopped." Cleared her throat. "Tried again. Nobody's ever brought me flowers before." A long pause. "Never?" "Never." He looked at her. Then he leaned forward and set the bundle of flowers gently on top of the linen basket, right at the edge where she could reach them without stretching. "Well," he said quietly, "first time for everything." "I reckon." He set his hat back on his head and walked back around the side of the house toward the road. Clara stood beside the laundry line with the afternoon sun on her face and the blue flowers in the basket, and 15 years of being nobody's first cracking open inside her chest like drought-hardened ground after the first rain of the season. And she stood there long enough that the next sheet on the pile dried slightly at the edges before she finally picked it up. 3 days before the Grange dance. He caught her on the front porch. She was fixing a broken step. She'd noticed it going soft at the edge that morning. Catalogued it, added it to the list that only she kept and only she worked through kneeling on the boards with a hammer and a short row of nails, pressing the back of the damaged riser to test how far the rot had gone. "You need to replace the whole board," Everett said from the bottom of the steps. She looked up. "I know. I have lumber out at the property. I could bring a piece tomorrow morning. I can get a piece from Clara quietly," stopping her mid-sentence without any particular force, the way a hand on a door stops it from swinging. "Let me bring the lumber." She looked at him. He held her gaze without any impatience in it, just waited. "All right," she said. He climbed the 2 good steps and crouched beside her, close enough that she was acutely aware of how small the porch was, and looked at the damaged board with a carpenter's focus. Then he said, still looking at the board, "There's the Grange dance Saturday." Clara went very still with the hammer in her hand. "I know," she said carefully. "I'd like to take you the hammer." She focused very deliberately on the hammer. "You've spoken to my mother?" she asked. Because it was the practical question, and practical questions were armor. "This afternoon." She turned to look at him directly. "What did she say?" He met her eyes. "She said it was your decision," which meant Edith had said 10 other things before that, and none of them had been kind, and Everett had sat through all of them and arrived on this porch anyway. Clara looked back at the board. "I don't dance well," she said. "I don't either. I don't have a proper dress for— You have the blue cotton. You wore it Thursday last." Simple. Factual. Like he'd simply looked and remembered and seen nothing unusual about the fact of doing so. She stared at him. He had noticed what she was wearing 4 days ago. Josephine, who shared a room down the hall from Clara and had grown up with her face, could not have told anyone what color Clara's dress was on any given day. "Why me?" she said. Third time she'd asked him some version of this question. Each time felt more essential than the last. He set his elbows on his knees and looked at her without any deflection in it. "Because you're the most interesting person in this house," he said. "And I'd like to talk to you somewhere that isn't a kitchen doorway or a laundry line." Clara stared at him. "That's not a very romantic answer," she said finally. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, the very beginning of a smile that he was making a reasonable attempt to contain. "No," he agreed, "I reckon it's not." She looked at him for a long, measured moment. She said, "Don't be late. I have Sunday bread to start by 10. He stood up, and the almost smile had won whatever internal argument it had been having. "Yes, ma'am." And something in his voice, warm, unhurried, real in the specific way that things are real when they haven't been performed, settled somewhere inside Clara's chest and stayed there. Edith found her in the kitchen that evening. She stood in the doorway with her arms folded and said nothing for a moment, watching Clara work. "Then don't build this into something it isn't." Clara kept her hands moving. "I'm not building anything." Edith paused, choosing. "He's practical. Men starting out with property are always practical. I just don't want you to be foolish. I'm going to supper and a dance." "Mama, I'm not being foolish. You haven't been to a dance in 4 years. I know how long it's been." Edith was quiet for a moment. Then, quieter, in a different register entirely, the one she used so rarely that Clara always felt slightly disoriented when she heard it. Because it sounded like the mother she'd had before the boarding house took everything. "You deserve good things, Clara. I know I don't always." She stopped. "Started again. I just don't want to watch you get hurt." Clara turned. Edith was looking at her with an expression that was complicated and honest and slightly undone at the edges. And Clara recognized it with a small shock as fear. Her mother was afraid for her. It was the most loving thing Edith had said to her in years. It was also entirely backward because the thing Clara was most afraid of was not being hurt. It was being passed over again. "I'll be careful, Mama," she said. It wasn't a promise to stay safe. It was a promise to keep going. Josephine came to her room that night. She knocked twice, their old signal, from when they were children, and pushed the door open without waiting, and stood in the frame in her nightgown, with her dark hair loose over her shoulders, and her expression doing something complicated. Clara was sitting on the edge of her bed. They looked at each other. "He never asked me," Josephine said. Not an accusation. Just a statement of something she was still making sense of. "No," Clara said. "He barely looked at me." A silence. "Is that—" Josephine stopped, pressed her lips together. Tried again. And this time there was something raw in it. Something Clara had not expected from her bright-surfaced sister. "Is that what it feels like? When someone looks past you?" Clara looked at her for a moment. "Yes," she said simply. Josephine stood in the doorway for another few seconds. Then she nodded once, like she had received information she intended to carry carefully. "Don't let Mama talk you out of it," she said, and she closed the door. Saturday came in warm and clear, the way Montana in late June occasionally consented to. As if the weather had agreed to cooperate with something that mattered. Clara put on the blue cotton dress. She stood in front of the narrow mirror in her room and looked at herself the way she rarely allowed herself to look directly, without the usual rapid inventory followed by dismissal. Same brown hair. Same gray eyes that people sometimes charitably called serious and sometimes less charitably called plain. The same hands, slightly rough at the knuckles, that had been working hard things since she was 14 years old. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she put them down at her sides and straightened her spine. She went downstairs. Everett was in the front room, standing when he heard her on the stairs. He'd shaved clean. Dark coat carefully brushed, hair combed. He looked like a man who had taken care because the occasion merited it. Not because he wanted to be admired for it. He had the Blue Creek flowers again. Clara stopped on the bottom step. "You didn't have to," she said. "Third time you've said that," he said. She took them. He held the door for her, and she walked out into the June evening, and the door closed behind her. And Willow Creek was laid out ahead of them, in the last good light of the day. And for the first time, in longer than she was willing to calculate. Clara Whitman walked forward into the world, with someone beside her, who had chosen to be there. The Grange Hall was full and lit and loud with fiddle music that spilled out the open doors into the warm night. They felt the eyes before they reached the threshold. Not a sudden thing, gradual, like weather changing. Conversations that dipped as they passed, heads that turned. Harriet Boggs, who had taken Clara's free mending twice and never once said thank you, looked up from across the room and blinked slowly, like something that did not resolve into sense, no matter how long she stared at it. Everett put his hand very lightly at the small of Clara's back as they came through the door. Just his hand. Clara stood 2 inches taller. He found them 2 chairs near the wall, not hiding, just clear of the thickest crowd, and pulled one out for her. And Clara sat down in the middle of the Grange Hall dance in her plain blue dress and felt something strange and specific happening in her chest. She was sitting at a gathering, not carrying plates, not filling cups, not managing the comfort of everyone in the room before she'd had a chance to manage her own. She was simply sitting. "You all right?" Everett said, close to her ear over the fiddle. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. He looked at her with a question in his expression. "I can't remember the last time I sat down somewhere, and it wasn't because I'd run out of things to do," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then we'll sit as long as you want," he said. There's no race, they talked. She hadn't expected that either, how easy it was. Not the managed, careful kind of talk she did with guests. Always tracking what they needed, always aware of the surface beneath her feet. Just talk. He asked her about Willow Creek when she was small, and she found herself telling him about the creek in summer, and the way the whole valley smelled after rain. Things she hadn't said out loud to anyone in years, because nobody had asked. She told him about the music book. She wasn't sure why. It just came out, somewhere between his question about what she would have done differently and the honest answer she gave before she could think about whether to give it. "When I was 16, I found a book at Hatcher's on reading music. I taught myself some of it." She looked at her hands. "I wanted to learn more. There was never time, and then my mother needed the shelf space." And she shrugged once. "It's a small thing." "It's not a small thing," he said. She looked up. "A person's wanting something for themselves is never a small thing," he said. He said it without performance, without trying to make it land, which was exactly why it did. Whatever got in the way of it, that's the small thing. Clara looked at him for a moment in the lantern light. "You're an unusual man, Everett Callahan," she said. "I've been told," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. He stood up and held his hand out to her. She looked at it. "We agreed we're both bad at this," she said. "We did." His hand stayed out. Steady. Patient. "Come on, Miss Whitman. Let's embarrass ourselves equally." She took his hand and stood up. They were not good dancers. This became apparent within approximately 12 seconds. He nearly stepped on her left foot twice. She turned the wrong direction on a change, and they ended up briefly facing the same way, which produced a confused half-second before they sorted themselves out, and Clara laughed, a real laugh. Sudden and involuntary, startled completely out of her by the absurdity of it, and the sound of her own laughter surprised her so much that she laughed again. And Everett was watching her, with something in his expression that wasn't the half-smile she'd been seeing all week. This was something wider, something unguarded, something that looked, she thought with a small shock, like relief, like a man who had been hoping for something and had just found it. They stayed until 9:45. He walked her home under the wide Montana sky, with the stars out in full and the fiddle fading behind them. And the silence between them was the specific comfortable kind that only exists between two people who have stopped needing to fill it. At the boarding house door he stopped, turned his hat in his hands. "I enjoyed this evening," he said. "So did I." She meant it in a way she could feel all the way down. Regrouped. "Would you have supper with me?" "Not here, out at the property, I'd cook." She looked at him. "You cook?" Tolerably, a pause. "I make no grand claims." She looked at the door. She thought of her mother. She thought of Mrs. Fogarty's voice. She thought of a woman like her coming through the kitchen wall like smoke. She thought of his hand at the small of her back, and how she'd stood up straighter, and how that had come from inside her, not from him. "Thursday," she said. "6 o'clock, I'll come and walk." "I know you do." The almost smile again. Quieter this time. "More certain, I'd still like to walk you." Clara looked at him in the dark for a long, still moment. "Good night, Everett," she said, his name. First time, something in his expression shifted with it. Something settled. Something resolved. "Good night, Clara," he said. She went inside. She stood in the dark hallway with her back against the closed door, and the blue flowers still in her hand, and the whole quiet house around her. And she listened to the clock on the mantel, and a floorboard creaking upstairs, and her own heart moving at a pace that had no reasonable explanation. Then she went to the kitchen. She started the overnight soak for the Sunday bread. She worked in the same kitchens she had always worked in, at the same counter she had always stood at, with the same hands she had always used. But the blue flowers were in a glass of water on the windowsill. And she was smiling, small and private and belonging entirely to herself. The first thing in a very long time that did. Thursday came the way important days sometimes do, quietly, without announcement, arriving in the middle of ordinary things, so that you almost miss it until it's already there. Clara had told herself all week that it was just supper. Just a meal. Just two people sitting across a table. She had served 1,000 suppers. She had cooked for strangers and family, and guests who didn't bother to learn her name. Supper was not a significant thing. She told herself this while she pressed the blue dress again Tuesday morning. She told herself this while she checked the dress Wednesday night. She told herself this Thursday afternoon while she stood in the kitchen finishing the last of the dinner service, moving fast and clean through the cleanup, aware of the clock in a way she was not usually aware of it. At 5:15, Josephine appeared in the kitchen doorway. She leaned against the frame with her arms folded and watched Clara work for a moment. "Your hair," Josephine said. Clara didn't look up. "What about it?" "It's coming loose on the left side." Clara's hands went to the back of her head automatically. "Here." Josephine crossed the kitchen, and before Clara could object, her sister's hands were in her hair, quick and practiced. Repinning, smoothing, doing in 30 seconds what Clara could not have managed in 10 minutes in front of her narrow mirror. Her sister's hands were gentle, more gentle than Clara expected. When she finished, Josephine stepped back. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Don't," Josephine said, not unkindly. "Just go." Clara looked at her sister. Josephine looked back. Something honest was sitting in her expression that didn't have comfortable words around it yet. And both of them knew it, and neither of them pushed. Clara untied her apron and hung it on the hook. She went upstairs and put on the blue dress for the third time and came back down at 5:55. Everett was on the front porch. He was early. He had the hat in his hands the same way he always did. Turning it slowly, she was beginning to understand this was what his hands did when he was making himself be patient. He had cleaned up properly. He looked at her when she came through the door with the same direct, Unhurried attention she was still not entirely accustomed to. "You're early," she said. "I know." He settled his hat on his head. "I wasn't going to be late." They walked. The evening air was still warm and smelled of dry grass and something faintly sweet from the flowering brush along the road. And they walked side by side with a comfortable distance between them, not the careful, performed distance of people who are pretending not to be aware of each other, but the natural distance of two people who are simply walking the same direction. "Tell me about the property," Clara said. He glanced at her. "What do you want to know?" "What it looked like when you first saw it. Before you bought it." He considered this. "Rough," he said. The main structure had been empty 3 years. The fencing was down in 4 places. The well needed work. A pause. But the land itself started again, and there was something different in his voice when he did. Something less careful. You could see what it had been. And what it could be again. "That's what I bought, I think." Not what it was, what I could see it becoming. Clara listened to that. "That's not how most men talk about property," she said. "I'm not most men," he said. Not with arrogance, just plainly. She looked at him from the side. "No," she said. "I'm beginning to understand that." The ranch house was modest. She had expected that. And the reality matched the expectation in all the practical ways. Small structure, solid bones, rough edges that were being worked on one at a time. She could see evidence of recent labor everywhere. New boards on the porch, a repaired hinge on the gate, a fence post that was clearly newer than its neighbors. He worked with his own hands. She had known men who owned property and men who worked, and she had rarely seen both in the same person. The table inside was set the way he'd probably worked on most of the day. She thought 2 plates, 2 cups, a cloth laid down. A small lamp burning in the center. Nothing elaborate. Everything deliberate. She stood inside the door and looked at it. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He had made stew and biscuits. The biscuits were uneven, honestly, genuinely uneven. The kind that come from a man who knew the principle of biscuit making, but had not made enough of them for his hands to know it automatically. The stew was slightly oversalted. The coffee he poured after was strong enough to stand a spoon in. It was, without question, the best meal Clara Whitman had eaten in years. Not because it was good, because someone had made it for her. Because she was sitting down, and there was nothing she was supposed to be doing, and nobody whose cup needed filling, and the chair she was in had been pulled out for her before she arrived. And that the simple fact of that was almost more than she knew what to do with. "The biscuits are uneven," he said, watching her. "Yes. The stew needs less salt, a little." "The perfect," she said firmly. He looked at her. One corner of his mouth moved. "You're being kind, I'm being honest." "I like strong coffee." She set down her cup. "Nobody's ever made me supper before." A pause settled over the table. "Nobody," he said. "Not since my father." She looked at the lamp. "He used to make Sunday breakfast. Terrible eggs. We ate every bite." She hadn't talked about her father in years. She wasn't sure why it came out now, except that there was something in the way Everett listened, the specific. Unhurried, nothing behind it quality of his attention that made things come out. Things she'd put away, things she'd forgotten she was carrying. "What was he like?" Everett asked. "Loud," she said immediately. And then smiled at herself, because it was true, and she hadn't remembered it in years, her father's enormous laugh. The way he filled a room just by being in it kind. He believed people were generally trying their best, and he gave them enormous benefit of the doubt, even when they didn't deserve it. She paused. He always said the boarding house was for people who needed a soft landing. That's how he thought of it. Not a business. A soft landing. Is that how you think of it? She was quiet for a moment. "I think of it as something that needs to keep running," she said honestly. Everett looked at her steadily. "That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It's not." Something shifted in the air between them, something that felt like truth being acknowledged. which is a specific and slightly uncomfortable feeling, because once a truth is out, it doesn't go back in. What would you do? Everett said carefully. If the boarding house didn't need running. Clara looked at him. I don't think about that, she said. Why not? Because it's not useful, Clara. Her name? Steady. What would you do? She looked down at her hands wrapped around the coffee cup. Hands she'd stopped seeing years ago, except as instruments. Hands that worked. I don't know, she said quietly. That's the honest answer. I stopped asking the question so long ago, I'm not sure I remember what I wanted. She looked up. That sounds worse than I meant it to. It sounds true, he said. The music, she said before she decided to. I'd start there. If I had time, that was mine. She looked at him. I still hear music and know exactly what's happening in it. I just can't do anything with that knowledge. It sits there. Everett was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up from the table. She watched him cross to the far corner of the room, where something was leaning against the wall under a cloth. He lifted the cloth, a small upright piano, battered. Clearly old, the lacquer worn to bare wood in 2 places. But present. Real Clara stood up from the table, so fast her chair scraped back. Where did you? Came with the property, he said. Previous owners left it. I've had a man look at it. He says it's mostly in tune. He looked at her across the room. I don't know how to play. I was hoping to find someone who did. Clara walked across the room. She sat down on the small bench in front of it. She pressed one key. The note rang out clear, imperfect, slightly warm at the edges, the way old instruments get. Real. A real note from a real thing. Her right hand moved before her mind gave it permission. 3 notes. Then a 4th. The beginning of something she had taught herself 15 years ago from a book she no longer had. She stopped. Her hand was shaking slightly. Keep going, Everett said quietly from behind her. I'll make mistakes. I know. Keep going. She kept going. She played haltingly, with long pauses and 2 wrong notes that made her wince, and 1 passage she had to restart entirely. It was not good playing by any technical measure, but it was hers. Rested back from 15 years of silence, and when she finished and sat with her hands in her lap, the room felt different than it had before, like something had been returned to it. She turned around on the bench. Everett was sitting in the chair he'd pulled near, elbows on his knees, watching her with that expression she was starting to recognize, the one that wasn't pity and wasn't admiration exactly, but something more precise than either of those words. There you are, he said quietly. She stared at him. What? I've been watching you manage things for a week, he said. Feed people, fix things, hold everything together. That's who you are at the boarding house. He looked at her. That he nodded toward the piano. That's who else you are. I was wondering when she'd show up. Clara sat very still. Nobody had ever talked to her like that. Nobody had ever implied that she was more than one thing. Everett, she said, and her voice came out less steady than she intended. What is this? He looked at her. What do you mean? This. She gestured the table. The piano, the supper, all of it. What are you doing? He was quiet for a moment. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at his own hands. I had a life before this place, he said. Back east. On land my father left me. I ran it for 6 years after he died. I was good at it. He paused, and I was completely alone in it. Every day, doing the work, doing it well, and coming inside to a house where nothing was alive. Nothing was warm. He looked up at her. I don't want that again. I don't want to build something and have nobody across the table from me when the day's done. Clara held his gaze. That sounds like a practical reason, she said carefully. It's not. He said it simply, without heat, like he'd already thought this through and had landed somewhere solid. Clara, I've talked to every woman in this county worth talking to in the last 2 years. At every gathering, every social, every supper I've been invited to. And I've enjoyed exactly none of those conversations. I've thought about none of those women when I was driving back alone. He looked at her directly. I drove past your boarding house 3 times before I booked a room. I kept finding reasons to go by. Clara went very still. You didn't know me, she said. I knew what I saw, he said. I saw a woman who moved through the world like she was responsible for holding it together and didn't expect a single thing in return. I wanted to know why, and now you know, she said. It's not a remarkable reason. It's just what happened to me. I know, he held her gaze. And I think you've been so long in the habit of making yourself small that you've genuinely forgotten what size you actually are. The room was very quiet. Clara felt something in her chest that had no clean name, something cracking and opening at the same time. Which is a specific and frightening kind of feeling, because you can't control what comes through an opening. I should go, she said. It's getting late. Clara, I'm not running, she said quickly. I just stood up, pressed her hands flat against her skirt. Breathed. I need to think about this, all of this. She looked at him. I'm not accustomed to it. That's the truth. And I don't want to say something stupid because you've said something real and I don't know what to do with it yet. Everett stood. He looked at her for a moment, then nodded once, a slow, accepting nod, like a man who has learned to let things move at their own speed. I'll walk you back. You don't... Quiet. Immovable, I'm walking you back. They walked home mostly in silence. And it was still the comfortable kind, which Clara found almost more disorienting than conversation would have been. At the boarding house door she turned. The piano, she said. Yes? Would you stop? Start it again. Could I come back and play it? Not for supper, just the piano. Something moved in his expression. Quiet and warm and entirely unperformed. My door is open, he said. Whenever you want. She nodded. She went inside. She did not go to the kitchen. She went straight to her room and sat on the edge of the bed in the blue dress and pressed both hands over her face and breathed. Slowly into the small dark space she'd made and tried to locate some solid ground inside herself. What she found instead was the sound of 3 notes from a battered old piano, and the feeling of a room where someone had set a place for her before she arrived. She stayed in the dress longer than she should have. She was not entirely sure why, but she did not take it off until well past midnight, which was the latest she had stayed awake for something that wasn't working longer than she could accurately remember. Thursday turned into Friday, and Friday turned into the kind of Saturday that changes the shape of things. Walter Grady had been in Willow Creek his entire life and owned the largest cattle operation in the county, dressed and spoke and moved through the world like a man who had been told at an early age that his opinions were valuable and had never encountered sufficient evidence to the contrary. He was not stupid. He was not precisely cruel. He was simply a man who had never been required to consider that his assumptions might be wrong. And that specific kind of person is, in Clara's experience, often more dangerous than someone who means to cause harm. He came into the boarding house on Saturday morning. He came for Everett. Clara was in the dining room, clearing the breakfast things when she heard him in the front room, big voice. Confident stride, the particular energy of a man who walks into other men's houses like they are adjacent to his own. She heard Everett come down the stairs. Heard the greeting, the handshake, the immediate slide into Landtalk acreage. Water rights, the spring fencing condition, all of it in the shorthand of men who share a common vocabulary. She moved quietly, efficiently, doing what she did. She was invisible to Walter Grady, in the way furniture is invisible. He walked past her twice without acknowledgement. After a while, the conversation moved to the front porch, and she could hear it through the window as she worked Walter's voice carrying easily. Everett's lower and harder to catch. Then Walter said, clearly enough for her to hear through the glass, I see you've been spending time with the Whitman girl. A pause. Everett's Whitman. Yes. Something in Walter's voice not hostile. Which was almost worse. Just assessing. Like he was appraising stock. Smart thinking for a man in your position. New property. No help. You need someone who knows how to run a household. Clara Whitman's a hard worker, I'll give her that. A pause. Plain as a fence post, of course. But then a man starting out can't afford to be particular. Clara stopped moving. She was standing in the middle of the dining room with a stack of plates in both hands and the window 3 feet to her left. And she heard every single word. She stood there for a moment. Then she put the plates down carefully on the table. She heard Everett say something low, sharp, a single sentence she couldn't make out, and then Walter's voice again. Untroubled and slightly surprised. No offense meant. Callahan, just practical talk. Clara walked to the kitchen. She put both hands on the counter. She looked at the wall. Plain as a fence post. She had heard worse. She reminded herself of this. She had genuinely heard worse, and from people who were supposed to love her. And she had kept working through all of it. One man's opinion on a porch was not going to flatten her. She believed this. The back door opened. She turned fast. Everett came in from the outside, not through the front, but around the side of the house, as if he hadn't wanted to come back through the front room at all. He stepped into the kitchen and looked at her, and the look on his face told her immediately that he knew she had heard. Clara, don't. She turned back to the counter. Please don't. He had no right. He said what half the town thinks. She kept her hands flat on the counter. Kept her voice level. Don't pretend he's unusual. Everett crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and stopped close enough that she couldn't look at the wall without looking past him. She looked at the wall. Look at me, he said. She looked at him. His jaw was set. There was something in his eyes that she had not seen there before, not the steady calm she'd come to expect. But something harder underneath it. Something that had been disturbed. What he said was wrong, Everett said. It was his opinion. His opinion was wrong. He held her gaze. And there was nothing wavering in it. I need you to hear me say that. Not for my sake. For yours. Clara felt the thing in her chest doing the cracking open thing again. And she did not want it to do that right now, so she breathed carefully through it and kept her face from showing what she was feeling. Everett, she said. What Walter Grady said out there. She stopped. Pushed through. Is he wrong? He looked at her. About which part? You know which part. He held her gaze for a long moment. You want to know if I'm with you because you're useful. No, he said. Flat. Immediate, without theater. No, Clara. That is not why. She searched his face for the thing that would tell her whether that was true or whether it was kindness dressed up as truth. Which are different things, and she had enough experience with the second one to know the difference. She wasn't sure what she found. That scared her more than certainty in either direction would have. I need time, she said. I know, I'm not... She struggled. I don't distrust you. I want to be clear about that. I distrust myself. My own judgment. She stopped again. Started differently. I've been invisible for so long that I don't entirely know how to trust that someone is actually seeing me. That it's not just... She made a small frustrated gesture. That I'm not just making it into something it isn't because I want it to be. Everett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what would it take? She blinked. What would it take, he said steadily. For you to trust what you're seeing. She stared at him. It was the most disarming question anyone had ever asked her. Because it put the decision entirely in her hands, not his. Not the town's, not her mother's, hers. She didn't have an answer. I don't know yet, she said honestly. He nodded. Once. Slowly. Like that was a completely acceptable answer. Then I'll wait until you do, he said. He left the kitchen the same way he'd come in. And Clara stood at the counter, with her hands flat on the wood and her heart doing something complicated and unresolved. And she thought about a piano that had been left under a cloth in a corner and a man who had gone back to it and had a man check whether it was in tune. Before he'd ever asked her to supper, the thought arrived in her chest and sat there like a stone dropping into still water. She stood at the counter for a long time after. Sunday brought church, which in Willow Creek was as much a social institution as a religious one. which meant that by Sunday afternoon the town had already processed and redistributed everything Walter Grady had said on Everett Callahan's porch on Saturday morning. This was how Willow Creek worked. Information moved through it the way water moves through dry ground fast, following whatever path offered the least resistance. Clara knew this. She had lived here 29 years. She still wasn't entirely prepared for Mrs. Fogarty to appear beside her outside the church with her best commiserating expression and say, in a low voice that was clearly intended to carry, "Don't let what people say discourage you, dear. There's nothing wrong with a practical match." Many marriages have been built on less. Clara looked at her. "Good morning, Mrs. Fogarty," she said. She walked to where her mother was standing with two other women. The two women fell quiet as she approached in a way that told her everything about what they had been discussing 30 seconds before. Clara smiled. She was very good at smiling through things. She had been doing it since she was 14. Edith put her hand on Clara's arm briefly, a small gesture. Quick, the kind her mother deployed when she wanted to appear supportive without actually taking a position. "There's talk," she said quietly. "I know," Clara said. "It's not." Edith stopped. "People will say things. They always say things. Mama, about you and Mr. Callahan." She hesitated. "About why he might choose." "I know what they're saying," Clara said. She kept her voice low and even and looked at her mother directly. "Do you believe it?" Edith was quiet for a fraction too long. It wasn't a long pause. Another person might not have noticed it. Clara noticed it. She took her arm back gently from her mother's hand. "It's a lovely morning," she said. "I'll get started on Sunday dinner." She walked home. She was halfway there before her hands started shaking. Not from grief, not exactly. It was something closer to what happens when you have suspected something for a long time and then have it confirmed, not new pain. Exactly, but the very specific exhaustion of having the question resolved in the direction you always feared. Her own mother was not sure. Her own mother, when asked directly whether she believed her daughter was worth choosing for her own sake, had paused. Clara walked the rest of the way home with her head up and her pace steady and her face showing nothing. Because she was 29 years old, and she had mastered this particular performance long ago. She went into the kitchen. She started Sunday dinner. She peeled potatoes, and her hands shook until they stopped, which took about 10 minutes, and then they were steady again. That was how you did it. You kept your hands moving until the feeling had nowhere to go except into the work. And eventually the work absorbed it, and you came out the other side still standing. She had done this more times than she could count. She had always come out the other side. Everett came in from the back porch an hour later. He didn't say anything immediately. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and leaned against the counter with it, watching her work, and she let him, because she had run out of the energy required to send him away and wasn't sure she wanted to anyway. After a while he said, "How are you?" "Fine," she said. "Clara."
"I'm working on it," she said honestly, because she was done lying about this particular thing.
At least to him. He nodded. She kept peeling. He kept standing. After another few minutes she said, without looking up. My mother paused. He was quiet. When I asked her if she believed it what they were saying. She paused. Clara set down one potato and picked up the next. My own mother. Everett set down his coffee cup. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's not your fault, I know." "I'm still sorry." Something in the way he said it, not performing sympathy, not rushing to fix it, just putting the words down, plainly made the back of her throat tighten in a way she quickly breathed through. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "And will you tell me the truth even if you think it's not what I want to hear?" "Yes," he said. Without hesitation, she looked up from the potato. "Do you understand what you're walking into? The talk won't stop. People have decided what this is, and they'll keep deciding it. They'll say you chose me because I'm useful. They'll say it at every gathering and every social and every Sunday, outside every church in the county." She held his gaze. "Does that matter to you?" He looked at her for a long moment. "What matters to me," he said, "is what you think." "That's not an answer. It's the truest one I've got," he said. "Clara, I can't stop people from talking. I don't intend to live my life trying to. What I can tell you is what's true." He picked up his coffee cup again. "And what's true is that I've been in this county for 3 months, and I've met everyone worth meeting, and I drove past your boarding house 3 times before I went in. And none of that was practical calculation. I don't know how to make you believe that. I only know it's true." Clara looked at him. She wanted to believe it. That was the dangerous part. She wanted it badly enough to distrust the wanting. "I'll think about it," she said. "All right," he said. She looked back down at the potatoes. He stayed in the kitchen. And Clara kept working, which was the only thing she had ever known how to do. But for the first time in a very long time, the silence she was working in didn't feel empty. It felt like someone was in it with her, which was either the beginning of something real, or the beginning of the worst mistake she'd ever made. She didn't know yet which, but she kept her hands moving. And she did not ask him to leave. The week after Sunday started the way bad weeks often do, quietly. Without warning, with nothing on the surface to indicate that something underneath was already moving. Clara went back to the piano on Monday. She told herself it was just the piano. She told herself she was going because of the music, not because of the man, and that these two things were separate and she was capable of keeping them that way. She told herself this with considerable conviction all the way up the road to the Callahan property. And she almost believed it right up until she came through the gate and saw Everett on the far side of the yard repairing a section of fence. And he looked up, and the look on his face when he saw her was so unguarded and immediate that she had to look away from it. "Doors open," he called across the yard. She nodded and went inside. She sat at the piano and she played. She played badly and then less badly, and then, in the third piece she attempted, something loosened in her hands the way things loosen when you stop fighting them. And for about 4 minutes she played something that was genuinely, honestly good, not practiced, but real and felt and entirely hers. She stopped when she heard the back door. Everett came in from outside, pulling his work gloves off, and stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. "Nothing." She pressed the keys softly. "Not enough to sound them. I played it right for a minute." He looked at her. "That's not nothing," he said. She looked down at the keys. "No," she said quietly, "I suppose it isn't." He sat in the chair he'd pulled near before, the same one. She noticed, like it had become its assigned position, and she played for another half hour while he worked on something at the table behind her. Some piece of equipment that needed mending, and neither of them spoke much. And the quiet between them was the specific quality of quiet that exists between two people who have stopped needing noise to fill the space. When she stood to go, he walked her to the gate. At the gate she turned. "Same time Thursday?" Something in his expression settled. "Yes," he said. "Same time Thursday." She walked home. She was smiling before she reached the first bend in the road. And she knew it, and she didn't stop. That was Monday. By Wednesday, the town had decided. She first understood the full shape of it at Hatcher's General Store, where she went every Wednesday morning for supplies. She had been doing this run for 11 years. Tom Hatcher knew her order by heart. The whole thing usually took 20 minutes. She was at the counter when she heard Vera Ashworth's voice behind her, the older Ashworth sister, the one with the sharp face and the sharper opinions, who had been at the Grange dance and had watched Clara and Everett on the floor. Vera was speaking to someone near the dry goods shelves. She was not making any effort to be quiet. "A man doesn't choose a woman like Clara Whitman for romance," Vera said. The kind of declarative sentence that doesn't invite argument because it's dressed up as simple fact. He chooses her for the same reason you choose a good plow horse. Reliable, doesn't complain, knows how to work. Clara stood at the counter. Tom Hatcher looked at her. His expression was the particular expression of a man who has heard something said in his presence that he doesn't agree with and doesn't know what to do about. Clara picked up her package. "Thank you, Tom," she said. Her voice was level. She walked to the door, she pulled it open. And then, because she had spent 29 years in this town, and was so tired so profoundly, bone-deep tired of making herself smaller so that other people would be comfortable, she stopped. She turned around. Vera Ashworth looked up. "Vera," Clara said. Her voice was steady. She was slightly amazed by this. "I've heard what you've been saying. Around town, and just now," she held the woman's gaze. "I want you to consider something. You've known me my entire life. You've eaten food I cooked. You've sat in rooms I cleaned. And in all that time, you've never once looked at me long enough to wonder whether I might have a preference about my own life." Vera opened her mouth. Clara was not finished. "I'm not a plow horse," she said. "And I'm not asking your permission to be seen." She walked out. She made it around the corner of the building before her hands started shaking. And she stood against the wall in the narrow side alley with her supply package clutched to her chest and her heart hammering and her breath coming faster than she'd like. And she thought that was either the bravest thing she had ever done or the most foolish. And she genuinely could not decide which. Then she thought, both. It was probably both. She pushed off the wall and walked home. She told no one. But Tom Hatcher told his wife, and his wife told 2 other women. And by Thursday evening, half of Willow Creek had a version of the story. And in most versions, it was better than what actually happened. Which is usually how these things go. Thursday came. She went to the piano. Everett was inside this time. At the table when she arrived. He had coffee already made and a second cup set out, which she noticed and did not comment on, because commenting on it would mean acknowledging that he had expected her and that she had come, and that these 2 facts together meant something neither of them had fully named yet. She sat at the piano. She played. At some point she wasn't tracking time the way she usually tracked time, which was itself unusual, he said from behind her. "There's a harvest gathering Saturday. The Grady property." Her hands stilled on the keys. Walter Grady's property. She understood immediately what that meant. Walter Grady hosted the biggest social gathering of the harvest season every year. Every family in the county came. It was the kind of event where Willow Creek showed itself to itself, where the social order was displayed and confirmed, and anyone operating outside of it was very clearly visible. "I know about it," she said. "Will you come with me?" She turned on the bench. He was looking at her directly. "No hedging, Everett," she said. "Do you understand what that will be like?" "Yes. Walter Grady will be there. Every person who's been talking will be there. It will be," she searched for the right word, "public. In a way that the dance wasn't. The dance was one evening." "This is a statement." "I know what it is," he said. "I need you to be sure, Clara." His voice was quiet, but there was something absolutely immovable in it. "I asked you to come to a gathering at a man's property who has already said unkind things about you in my presence. Do you think I've done that without thinking it through?" She looked at him. "What did you say to him?" "On the porch. Last Saturday. I heard you say something and I couldn't make it out." Everett was quiet for a moment. "I told him," he said carefully, "that the next time he spoke about you in that manner in front of me, we were going to have a different kind of conversation." Clara stared at him. "You said that to Walter Grady?" "Yeah." "Walter Grady, who owns the largest cattle operation in the county, and whose goodwill you need as a new rancher?" "Yes." She stared at him for another long moment. Then she turned back to the piano. "Saturday," she said. "What time?" She heard something in the quality of the silence behind her change. "Warm. Settled," he said. "I'll be ready at 2. She played 3 more pieces. And she played the last one so cleanly that when it ended, Everett said nothing at all, which was exactly the right response. Saturday arrived with the particular bright cruelty of a beautiful day that has no interest in making things easier. Clara wore the blue dress again. She knew people would notice she was wearing the same dress she'd worn to the dance. She put it on anyway. She was done apologizing for the contents of her wardrobe to people who had never inquired what was in it. Everett came to the door at 2 o'clock exactly. He had flowers. She looked at them, looked at him. "You're going to keep doing this," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She took the flowers. They walked. The Grady property was already full when they arrived. Wagons along the fence line, people spread across the yard in clusters. The sound of voices and children, and someone playing a fiddle badly somewhere near the barn. The kind of gathering that looks cheerful from a distance and is considerably more complicated up close. They felt the shift the moment they came through the gate. It was not subtle. The nearest group of people, 4 women who had been talking, went quiet in a way that was deliberate enough to be its own statement. Then the ripple moved outward, the way ripples do, until the whole nearest quarter of the gathering had registered their arrival. Clara felt it on her skin. Everett put his hand at the small of her back. She stood straighter. They moved into the gathering. For a while, things were managed. People who knew Everett greeted him, were polite to Clara by extension, and moved on. A few people, fewer than Clara had hoped, more than she'd feared, greeted her directly, with genuine warmth. Tom Hatcher's wife found her inside the first 20 minutes and took her hand and held it for a moment and said, simply, "Good for you," which Clara received with more emotion than she showed. They were near the far fence, talking to an older rancher named Birch and his wife, when Walter Grady arrived. He came from the direction of the barn with 2 other men. Big and loud and completely in his element, in a way that men are when they are on their own property and have never had reason to question whether they belong there. He saw Everett. He looked at Clara once. Then he looked at Everett and said, loudly enough for a comfortable radius to hear, "Callahan, glad you came." He clapped Everett on the shoulder with the territorial ease of a man who considers himself a benefactor to whoever he acknowledges. "Brought your housekeeper, I see." The air went out of the immediate vicinity. Clara heard it, the precise collective intake of breath, the going still of the people nearest them. Everett did not move. When he spoke, his voice was exactly the same temperature it always was. Low, unhurried, the kind of voice that doesn't need to rise because it already has weight. "That's Miss Whitman," he said. "She's with me, of course." "Of course," Walter smiled, the smile of a man who doesn't recognize a line when he's crossed it. "No offense meant. I know what you meant." Everett looked at him steadily. "Walter, you're a man who runs a successful operation. You know the difference between something valuable and something you value. I'd encourage you to learn the difference between those 2 things before you speak about Miss Whitman again." The silence that followed was the specific and total kind that happens when something has been said that cannot be taken back. Walter Grady stared at him. His face did something complicated: surprise first, then something that wanted to be anger, and then, because Everett had said it so precisely and quietly and without performance, something that was grudgingly close to recalibration. He looked at Clara. For the first time, Walter Grady actually looked at her. Not at what she represented, not at her function, at her. Then he said stiffly, "Miss Whitman," a nod, and he walked away. Clara stood very still. Birch beside them cleared his throat quietly and said something to his wife about the food. And they drifted with tact. And Clara and Everett were briefly alone in their small circle of cleared space. And she was aware of her own heartbeat and the eyes on her back and the sound of conversations resuming around them, slowly, like water finding its level. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "It's going to make things harder with him. Probably." She turned and looked at him. "You don't care. Not even a little," he said, and then, quieter, "Are you all right?" She took a breath. Let it out. "I don't know yet." He nodded. They stayed 2 more hours. In those 2 hours, something shifted. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment she could have pointed to afterward. But gradually, the way weather changes gradually, the social temperature around them moved. People who had been watching from a distance drifted closer. Conversations that had gone quiet when they approached started staying open instead. A woman named Ruth Farley, who had taught school for 30 years and had known Clara since she was 7, came and stood with them for a long stretch and talked to Clara, directly asked her questions. Listened to the answers, laughed twice at things Clara said, in a way that Ruth had never quite done before. And that Clara understood was a kind of public endorsement from a woman whose opinion carried weight. The tide was not turned, not completely, but it had moved. When they left, walking back in the late afternoon light, Clara waited until the Grady property was out of sight behind them before she said anything. Then she said, "Thank you. You don't have to thank me for that. I know I don't have to." She looked at him. "I want to." He glanced at her. "He called me your housekeeper," she said. "In front of everyone." "I know. And you?" She stopped. Breathed. Most men would have laughed it off. Changed the subject. Let it go, because making a scene with Walter Grady isn't worth the cost. She looked at him steadily. "You didn't let it go. Why?" He walked a few more steps before he answered. "Because you were standing right there," he said. "And you have been standing right there in one way or another for 29 years. And I'm not willing to stand next to you and let someone erase you." Clara stopped walking. He stopped too. She looked at him in the late afternoon light, with the road empty ahead of them and behind them and the whole wide Montana sky overhead. And she felt something in her chest that was large enough and real enough and undeniable enough that she finally stopped trying to name it or contain it or talk herself out of it. She stepped forward. She took his hand. He went still. She had never initiated contact before. Neither of them needed to say this. They both knew it. She held his hand on the empty road in the afternoon light. "I'm not going to tell you I'm certain," she said. "I don't do well with certainty I haven't earned. But I'm going to stop running from this." He looked at her hand in his. Then at her face. "That's enough," he said quietly. "Is it?" "Yes, Clara." Something in his voice was different now, lower. More open. Like something had been put down that he'd been carrying carefully for a while. "That is more than enough." They started walking again. She kept hold of his hand. He kept hold of hers. And if anyone had been watching from the Grady property gate, which possibly someone was, they would have seen two people walking down a Montana road in the last of the afternoon light, holding on to each other the way people hold on when they have decided, not rashly, not carelessly, but finally, that this is the thing they are not letting go. It should have been the end of it. In a fair world. It would have been. But Willow Creek was not a fair world. And the following week brought something that Clara had not seen coming. Which was the thing that finally broke her open entirely, not in the way breaking usually works, which is destructive, but in the way certain things break that have been sealed too long. With relief and with the particular raw honesty that comes after. It was her mother, not Mrs. Fogarty, not Vera, not Walter Grady. It was a Tuesday evening. 9 days after the Grady gathering. The house was quiet. The guests were upstairs. Josephine was out. May was reading in the front room. And Edith came into the kitchen while Clara was finishing the dishes, and she sat down at the kitchen, which Edith almost never did in the kitchen, because the kitchen was Clara's space, and Edith had tacitly understood this for years without ever acknowledging the understanding, and she folded her hands on the table and she said, "I need to talk to you about Mr. Callahan." Clara kept washing. "All right," she said. "The Farley woman was in here today." Edith paused. She said, "Things are being said. About you and Mr. Callahan." About another pause. Edith choosing her words with the care of a woman who knows some words cannot be taken back. "About whether his interest in you is genuine." "I know what's being said." "Mama, do you know what's being said specifically?" Because Ruth Farley was quite specific. Edith's voice was careful. But underneath the care there was an edge that Clara recognized her mother's particular brand of anxiety, which always showed up dressed as practicality. "People are saying he's using you." That he'll keep your company through the winter while the property gets settled. And then he'll find himself a proper match in the spring. Clara turned off the water. She stood at the sink with her back to her mother. I've considered that, she said. And I've decided to trust my own judgment. She turned around. Which I realize is a new practice for me. But I'm trying it. Edith looked at her. Clara, Mama. Clara came and sat down across from her mother at the kitchen table. She sat the way she never sat in her own kitchen directly. Fully, like she had a right to take up the space. I need to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly. Edith straightened slightly. When I asked you outside church, Clara said, whether you believed it what people were saying about why he'd choose me. You paused. Edith looked at the table. Mama, I need to know. Do you think I am worth choosing? The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, something moved in the yard. The clock on the mantel in the front room ticked. May turned a page. Edith's face did something complicated and slow. And then, to Clara's complete astonishment, her mother's eyes filled with tears. Not performance tears. Not the social, real ones. Rising up from somewhere deep, from something Edith Whitman had been sitting on for a long time. I think, Edith said, in a voice that was quieter and more honest than Clara had heard from her in years, that I spent so long teaching you girls what you were worth in the world's eyes that I forgot to teach you what you were worth in mine. She pressed her lips together. I told Josephine she was beautiful because I wanted her to know her value. I told May she was sweet because I wanted her to be confident. And I told you she stopped. You told me I was useful, Clara said. Yes. Edith's voice broke slightly on the word, because I was afraid. You were the one I counted on. You were the one who kept everything running. And I told myself that saying you were needed was the same as saying you were valued. Her hands tightened on the table. It isn't the same thing. Clara sat with that. She had waited 29 years to hear something in the vicinity of those words. She had imagined, in her harder moments, that hearing them would feel triumphant, or cathartic, or clarifying the way answers to old questions are supposed to feel. What she actually felt was something more complicated than any of that. Grief, yes, but also underneath the grief past it something softer. Something that had been held rigid for a very long time and was now, carefully, being allowed to move. I know you love me. Mama, she said. Do you? Edith looked at her with unshielded eyes. I'm not sure I've made it clear. No, Clara said honestly. You haven't always. She held her mother's gaze. But I know it's there. I've always known it was there. She paused. I just needed to hear it differently. Edith reached across the table. She put her hand over Clara's. They sat like that for a while, mother and daughter, in a kitchen that had been Clara's domain for 15 years. The clock ticking in the next room. The evening settling around them, and the silence between them was the specific complicated silence of two people who have finally said a true thing to each other after a very long time of saying almost true things instead. Do you love him? Edith asked. Clara looked at her mother's hand over hers. I don't know yet, she said. I think I might be starting to. She paused. I know that when I'm with him I feel like myself. Like the full version of myself, not the managed one. She looked up. I haven't felt that way since before Papa died. Edith was quiet. He's a good man, she said finally. It cost her something. Clara could tell it cost a woman like Edith something to revise an opinion she'd already sorted. I didn't want to see it at first. I was looking at him the wrong way. I know, Clara said. He came and spoke to me again, Edith said. 3 days ago. Did he tell you? Clara went still. He came and sat in the front room and he told me. Edith paused. And something in her expression shifted into a respect she hadn't been wearing before. He told me that he intended to ask you to marry him. That he wasn't asking my permission because you were a grown woman and it wasn't his to ask. But that he wanted me to know because he understood that your family mattered to you, even when your family... She stopped again. Her voice was careful. even when your family had perhaps not always shown you what you deserved. Clara stared at her mother. He said that in those words. Edith's eyes were very bright. I thought you should know. Clara looked at the table. He had gone to her mother, not to ask permission, not to perform the ritual because it was expected. To tell her, to give Edith the chance to show up for her daughter in a way she hadn't always shown up. He had done that, for her. The thing in her chest that had been cracking open for 2 weeks finally gave way entirely. And what came through was not grief and not fear, and not the careful managed blankness she had built over 15 years of being useful and invisible. What came through was something she hadn't let herself feel in so long, she had almost forgotten it had a name. She wanted this, she wanted him, not because she was lucky to be chosen. Not because the alternative was worse, not because she was practical or useful or good at running a household. Because she was Clara Whitman, and she had a particular laugh that surprised even herself. And she had hands that knew how to coax music out of a battered piano. And she had a way of seeing things that was entirely her own. And she was worth a seat at someone's table, her own included. She stood up. Mama, she said. Thank you, Clara said. For telling me. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed. She thought about a man who drove past a boarding house 3 times before he went in. Who brought flowers from a creek bank. Who had an old piano tuned before he ever mentioned it. Who went to her mother not to ask permission, but to give Edith the chance to be the mother Clara needed. Who had asked, with complete seriousness, what would it take, and had meant it. Had waited, had not pushed. Clara sat on the edge of her bed in the quiet of the boarding house, and she made a decision. Not the tentative kind. Not the kind she could talk herself back out of. She was done waiting to trust herself. She was done waiting to feel sure enough. She was sure enough right now, sitting in her own room in her own house, knowing what she knew. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she would go to him. Not because he'd asked. Not because she was grateful. Not because she was afraid of being alone. Because she was Clara Whitman. And for the first time in 29 years, she was choosing something for herself. And she was not going to apologize for it. She lay back on the bed. She stared at the ceiling. Outside, the Montana night was doing what it did, wide and dark and absolutely indifferent to the small pivoting dramas of human hearts. Clara didn't mind. She had always liked the dark. It was where you found out what you were made of. She already knew the answer. She had always known. She had just been waiting for someone to ask the right question. She was up at 4:47, same as always, the fire. The water, the biscuits, the coffee. Her hands moved through the morning routine the way they always moved, automatic. Efficient, without needing to be told what came next. But something was different inside the routine. The way a familiar road feels different when you know it's the last time you'll walk it in a particular direction. Not worse, just different, weighted with the awareness of itself. Clara pressed the biscuit dough and thought about what she was going to say. She had been thinking about it since midnight, when she had finally stopped pretending she was going to sleep and had lain in the dark instead, with her hands folded on her chest, working through it the way she worked through anything that required precision. Not the emotional part, she had already moved through the emotional part. Sitting on the edge of her bed the night before, with her mother's words still settling into her like sediment, finding the bottom of still water. The emotional part was done. This was the practical part. What she was going to say. How she was going to say it. How to say something true without making it sound like surrender. Because it wasn't surrender. That was the thing she needed him to understand before anything else. She was not coming to him because she had run out of other options, or because the town's opinion had ground her down, or because her mother had finally said the right thing and tipped her over. She was coming to him because she had made a decision, with her whole self, in the quiet of her own room. And the decision was hers. The biscuits went in. The coffee came off the fire. Clara set the table 6 plates, 6 cups, 6 sets of silverware, laid out straight, and then she stood at the end of it and looked at the empty chair at the near end, where she never sat. And she pulled it out and sat down in it, just for a moment. She sat at her own table in the early morning dark before any guest had come down. And she put her hands flat on the surface, and she breathed. Then she stood up, pushed the chair back in, and went to finish the morning. Everett came down at 5:30, earlier than usual. He came through the kitchen door first, which was not his usual path to the dining room. And Clara understood without needing it explained that he had come early and come through the kitchen because he had heard her moving and had wanted not to intrude, not to push, just to be close to wherever she was. She had started to understand how he operated. He showed up. He stayed. He did not make demands of the showing up and staying. "Coffee's on," she said, without turning around. "Thank you." She heard him pour a cup. Heard him settle against the counter at a respectful distance. She finished what she was doing, slicing bread for the morning basket, and then she turned around and looked at him directly. "I'm coming to the property today," she said. After the noon service, he looked at her over his coffee cup. "All right," he said, carefully, like a man who can feel that something is different and is being very deliberate about not mishandling it. "Not for the piano," she said. A pause. "I understand," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the bread. "Don't be out in the far field," she said. "I want you there when I arrive." "Yes, ma'am," he said. She heard the smile in it without seeing it. She didn't let herself smile back until she was facing the other way. The morning was long in the particular way that mornings are long when you are waiting for something you have decided on. Not anxious exactly. Anxiety implies uncertainty. And Clara had moved past uncertainty the night before. More like the specific quality of time that stretches between deciding and doing, when there is nothing to do but get through the hours between. She managed the breakfast service. She cleaned up. She made herself eat something standing at the counter, an old habit she was aware she ought to break and had not broken yet. She checked on the guest rooms. She spoke to Edith briefly in the hallway. And Edith looked at her face, and something in her mother's expression went quiet and knowing. And Edith simply said, "The afternoon service can manage without you," which was as close as Edith Whitman had ever come to saying go. And Clara received it as such. At noon she untied her apron and hung it on the hook. She did not put on the blue dress. She was wearing her everyday brown one, the practical one, the work one, and she did not change it, because she was not going as a performance. She was going as herself. She walked to the Callahan property. The gate was open. The yard was quiet. The door to the ranch house was standing slightly ajar the way it always stood when he was inside, and not working the far field. She pushed it open. Everett was at the table. He had been doing something with Paper's property records, by the look of it, and he had clearly heard her footsteps on the porch because he was already turned toward the door when she came through it. He looked at her. She looked at him. And then, before she could say anything she had planned, before the careful measured words she had been assembling since midnight could arrange themselves in the right order, she said, "I owe you an apology." He went still. "For what?" he said. "For every time I questioned your motives when you had given me no reason to." She stayed by the door, not retreating, just finding her footing. "I know why I did it. I understand why I did it. But understanding a thing doesn't make it right. And I spent a lot of time waiting for you to prove you were something you weren't." Which wasn't fair. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were protecting yourself." "Yes, but I was protecting myself from you. And you weren't the one who needed to be protected against." She looked at him steadily. "The town did that. My mother did some of it, years did most of it. But you didn't." She paused. "I'm sorry for making you stand in for all of them." Everett set down the paper he'd been holding. He stood up. He crossed the room toward her, and she stood her ground, not defiantly, just solidly. Because she was done backing up, and he stopped at a distance that was close enough to be honest, and far enough to give her room. "Clara," he said, "I need you to hear me say something." "All right, I understood," he said. "Every time you pulled back, every time you questioned it, I understood. You had every reason. I was not standing in that kitchen being patient, because I'm a particularly patient man. I was standing there because you were worth standing there." For he looked at her. "And because I could see that the woman you are when you're not protecting yourself is someone I very much want to know for the rest of my life." The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere across the yard, a bird started up and then stopped. "I'm not protecting myself right now," she said. "I know," he said. "I can tell." She took one step toward him, just one. Deliberate. "I'm not coming here because I'm grateful," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not here because you defended me to Walter Grady, or because you went to my mother, or because the alternative is going back to the boarding house and spending another 15 years being the person everyone needs. And nobody sees." She held his gaze with everything she had. "I'm here because I want to be, because I choose to be. Because when I sat in my room last night and asked myself what I actually wanted for the first time in years, I let myself ask that question. Honestly, the answer was you." Everett looked at her. Something in his face moved, something that started behind his eyes and worked its way out slowly. The way feeling works its way out in a person who doesn't perform their emotions, but experiences them fully and privately. "Clara Whitman," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have been trying to find the right moment to ask you something for 3 weeks." He said it with the particular rueful honesty of a man acknowledging his own failed timing. "And I have talked myself out of it no fewer than 6 times, because I was afraid of pushing too fast and losing the whole thing." She almost smiled. "You were afraid." "Considerably," he said, without embarrassment. "I'm not afraid of much. I was afraid of this. Ask me," she said. He looked at her. "Are you sure?" "Everett," she said his name the way she'd started saying it directly. Without ceremony, like it belonged in her mouth. "I just walked through town in my work dress without fixing my hair to come and tell you I choose you." "I am sure." He let out a breath. Then he said, "I don't need a woman to run my ranch. I need a woman who makes this place feel like there's a reason to come inside when the day's work is done." He held her gaze. "I need the woman who plays that piano like she's taking something back. I need the woman who stood in Hatcher's and said what she said to Vera Ashworth and then walked out and shook for 10 minutes in the alley, because she did it anyway." He paused. "I need you, not a version of you that's useful. You." Clara stared at him. "How do you know about the alley?" "Tom Hatcher," he said. He told his wife. His wife told Mrs. Birch. Mrs. Birch told me. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "This is a small town, Clara." She laughed, a real laugh that startled. Involuntary kind, caught off guard, and when the sound of it filled the small room he was looking at her. He had been looking at her at the Grange dance. With that wide, unguarded expression that she had a name for now. She had had a name for it for a while. She just hadn't let herself use it. "Yes," she said. "Clearly. Whatever you're asking, yes." "I haven't technically asked yet," he said. "Then ask." He took both her hands. She let him. She felt his grip firm and warm and steady in the specific way that was just him. Not performed, not careful, just the way his hands were, and she looked at them for a moment before looking up. "Clara Whitman," he said. "Will you marry me?" She looked at him. She thought about a table set with 2 plates and a cloth lamp and biscuits that were uneven. She thought about a piano uncovered in a corner, tuned and waiting. She thought about flowers from the creek, brought a 3rd time and a 4th. Brought so consistently that she had stopped being surprised by them and started expecting them. Which is its own kind of love. She thought about a man who stood in a kitchen and said, "When I said what I said out there, it wasn't about the biscuits," and then walked away and let her figure out what that meant. "Yes," she said. He held her hands for a moment. Then he pulled her toward him. Gently, and she went, and she pressed her face against the rough wool of his jacket and closed her eyes. And his arms came around her solidly, not tightly. Not possessively, just solidly, the way a good thing feels when it finally arrives, and she stood in the middle of the ranch house in her work dress, with her hair not fixed, and breathed. She was not thinking about the boarding house. She was not thinking about the morning routine or the guests' cups or the bread that needed starting or anything that required her to be useful to anyone. She was just here, in these arms, being exactly who she was. That was new. That was the newest thing she had felt in 29 years. She was not going to waste a single second of it. They stayed like that until the bird outside started up again and kept going. And then Clara pulled back enough to look at him, and she said, "We need to tell my mother." Something flickered in his expression. Today, she said firmly. Before she hears it from Tom Hatcher's wife, he looked at her. "You're practical," he said. "I am," she agreed. "You knew that when you chose me." "I did," he said. "I chose you anyway, despite it, because of it," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment. Then she straightened up and smoothed her skirt and said, "Come on then, let's go." He got his hat. They walked back to the boarding house side by side, and this time, when they came through the gate and up the front walk, Clara did not look at it the way she had looked at it for 29 years as a thing that owned her, as a thing she owed. She looked at it the way you look at something you are choosing to return to, which is an entirely different relationship. Edith was in the front room. She looked up when they came in. She looked at Clara's face. She looked at Everett's hand, holding the door for Clara. She put down the mending in her lap. "Mama," Clara said, "Everett has asked me to marry him." Edith looked at Everett. "And you said yes," Edith said. "I said yes," Clara confirmed. Edith was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that is doing a great deal of internal work. Then she said, "To Everett, you'll take care of her, Mrs. Whitman," Everett said, with complete seriousness. "She is substantially better at taking care of herself than either of us gives her credit for. But yes, I'll do everything in my power to make sure she never has to do it alone again." Edith pressed her lips together. Her eyes went bright. "Well," she said after a moment, "then I suppose I'd better find out what state the blue dress is in. Because we'll need it for a wedding." Clara laughed. Edith stood up, and then, to Clara's complete and total astonishment, her mother crossed the room and put both arms around her. Properly, the full embrace that Edith Whitman rationed like something in short supply, and held on. Clara stood in her mother's arms in the front room of the boarding house she had been running since she was 14 years old. And something inside her that had been braced some last tightened piece, some final resistance she hadn't even known she was still holding, let go. She held on. Josephine appeared at the top of the stairs. She looked down at the three of them, Clara in Edith's arms, Everett standing near the door with his hat in his hands, and something crossed her face. Complicated. Real. Then she came down the stairs. She stopped in front of Everett. She looked at him for a moment with the direct, appraising look of a woman who wants to say the true thing and is deciding how to say it. "If you hurt her," Josephine said, "I will make your life very difficult." Clara started. "I mean it," Josephine said, not looking away from Everett. Everett looked at her steadily. "I know you do," he said. "Good." Josephine looked at him a moment longer. Then she turned and put her arms around Clara, fast and fierce, the way Josephine did everything. "I'm happy for you," she said against Clara's shoulder. "I mean that. I know you do," Clara said. May appeared from the dining room doorway, assessed the situation in approximately 3 seconds, burst into happy tears, and attached herself to Clara's arm with the immediate wholehearted enthusiasm that was entirely characteristic of her. "I knew it," May said through the tears. "I told Joe last week. I said Clara is going to marry him, and Joe said she was too practical, and I said May." Josephine said, "I'm just saying I was right. You can be right quietly." Clara laughed. She laughed with her family in the front room of the boarding house, her mother drying her eyes with the corner of her apron. her sisters tangled up on either side of her, and Everett watching all of it from near the door with the expression she had named, but would not say out loud, yet would wait until the right moment to say out loud. When they were alone and the room was quiet, and there was nothing else that needed doing, she would say it then. She was not afraid of it. She had never been afraid of it. She had only been afraid that it would not be said back. She was not afraid of that anymore. The wedding was set for the first Saturday of October. 6 weeks away, which Edith said was not enough time to do it properly, and Clara said was plenty of time to do it right, and they were both correct in ways that were not mutually exclusive. Which was how most things with Edith went. The town's reaction was what it was. Some people were warm. Ruth Farley was the first to come by with congratulations, which Clara had expected and was grateful for. Tom Hatcher shook Everett's hand for a long time outside the general store without saying much, which was the most sincere form of approval Tom Hatcher had. Several of the older women, who had been friendly with Edith, came around within the first week, and they were pleasant, and they ate Clara's cooking, and drank her coffee, and said all the right things. Some people were less warm. Vera Ashworth was seen making a face in the post office when the engagement was mentioned, which Clara heard about secondhand and found she cared about approximately as much as she cared about the pinions of the fence posts Vera had once compared her to. Walter Grady said nothing directly, but he sent a bottle of good whiskey to the boarding house with a note that said only Callahan congratulations W. G and Clara and Everett looked at the note for a moment, and then Everett said, "He's not a bad man. He just doesn't think before he talks," and Clara said, "Neither do most of the people who've ever hurt me," and they looked at each other with a specific understanding of two people who have decided to build something together and know that the building will require patience. She went to the piano every Tuesday and Thursday. She went alone on Tuesdays, when Everett was in the far field, because she had decided that the piano was also hers, not his gift to her. Not something contingent on his presence, but something she had reclaimed and intended to keep. She played better every week. Not professional, not perfect, but improving, which is the only direction that matters. On Thursdays she went and Everett was there, and they had supper still slightly too salty, still with coffee that could wake the dead, and they talked. They talked about the property, and about the boarding house, and about what would happen to it when Clara left, which was a question that required careful handling, because the boarding house had functioned on Clara's back for 15 years, and there was no clean answer to what happened when that back was no longer available. "Josephine can run it," Clara said one Thursday evening. Everett looked at her. "Can she? She's more capable than she's ever been required to be," Clara said. "That's been the problem. Nobody's ever required it of her." She paused. "She'll surprise herself. And your mother? Mama will advise." Loudly. Clara smiled, "But she'll let Joe run it. She's more ready to let go than she knows." He looked at her. "You've thought about this a lot." "I've thought about this for years," she said simply. "I just didn't let myself believe it was possible." He reached across the table and took her hand. She let him. She had been letting him easily and without ceremony since the afternoon she had walked to the property in her work dress and chosen him, in her own words. Physical contact had lost its terrifying quality once she stopped treating it as evidence of something that might be taken away. "There's something I want to tell you," he said. She looked at him. The quality of his voice had shifted slightly, not anxious, but more serious. The voice he used when he was about to say something he'd been holding for a while. "When I drove past the boarding house those 3 times, he said. "Before I went in, I want to tell you what I saw." She waited. "The first time, you were on the front porch fixing the step. The same step I eventually helped with." He looked at her. "You were on your knees with a hammer, and you were completely focused, and there was nobody helping you, and you weren't waiting for help. You were just doing it." She remembered the step. "The second time, you were carrying something around from the back, a crate, I think." And he paused. "The third time, You were standing at the front gate, early in the morning, before the town was up, and you were just looking down the street. Not at anything specific, just looking. And you had this expression that I kept thinking about afterward. He looked at her. Like someone who's forgotten they're allowed to want things. Clara's throat tightened. And I thought, he shook his head slightly, I thought, if that woman would let herself want things, she'd be remarkable. I wanted to be there when she remembered. The room was very quiet. That she stopped, cleared her throat. That's a remarkable thing to say. It's a remarkable thing to see, he said simply. She looked at their hands on the table. I want things now, she said. I know. Specific things. She looked up. I want the piano to be in whatever house we build. Not in a corner, somewhere it gets light. She watched his face. I want Sundays to be slow. Not empty, I don't know how to do empty, but slow. A different kind of busy than the week. She paused. I want children, if we can have them. I want to teach them the music when I know enough to teach it. Something in his expression, the warmth that lived underneath the steadiness. The thing she had learned to look for moved. I want all of those things, he said. The piano especially, she said. The piano especially, he agreed. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Outside, the October air was coming in sharp and clean through the gap at the window frame. And it smelled like dry grass and coming winter, and the particular smell of a place that is about to change its season. And Clara sat at the table across from the man she had chosen, not been chosen by, but chosen, and felt the future arranging itself ahead of her in a completely different shape than the one she had spent 29 years assuming. It was not perfectly clear. She was realistic about that. There would be hard seasons and difficult years, and the ranch would take work, and the town would say what it said, and some mornings she would still wake up at 4:47 out of habit and lie in the dark for a moment wondering what she was supposed to be doing. But she would not be lying in that dark alone, and the table she woke up to, for the rest of her life, would have a place set at it for her. The first place set, the one nobody sat down to eat until Clara sat down first. She did not know this yet. She would learn it in the weeks after the wedding, when she discovered that Everett had a particular stubborn and immovable habit of standing beside her chair every morning, and not sitting in his own until she was in hers. And when she asked him why, he said, because you spent 15 years making sure everyone else was comfortable before you sat down. That's done now. She had argued with him about it. Once. He had listened to the whole argument with complete patience and then pulled her chair out and waited. She had sat down. She had not argued about it again. But she was not there yet. She was here at the Thursday supper table, with the coffee going cold between them and her hand in his, and the window letting in the October air. And she was thinking about a piano, light in the morning, and slow Sundays and children learning music. And she was thinking that 29 years is a long time to wait for something. But some things are worth every single year of the waiting. She had always believed that. She just had not believed, until now, that she was one of them. They married on the first Saturday of October, in the small church at the edge of Willow Creek, with the wind coming off the mountains the way it always did that time of year, cold and clean and smelling of something that had traveled a long distance to get there. Clara wore the blue dress, not because it was all she had. Edith had offered twice to commission something new, and Josephine had offered her own good dress, and May had offered 3 different alternatives with the enthusiasm of someone who considers clothing a genuine solution to most problems. Clara had considered all of these offers seriously, and declined all of them for the same reason. The blue dress was the dress she had been wearing the first time Everett looked at her, and did not look away. She was getting married in it. The church was not full. They had not invited the whole county, a decision that some people in Willow Creek found odd, and that Clara found straightforward. She wanted people in that church who were there for her, not for the spectacle of the boarding house woman marrying the rancher with the Hadley property. She had spent 29 years providing a service to people who hadn't thought of her as a person. Her wedding was not going to be another service. Edith sat in the front pew with her hands folded and her eyes already bright before the ceremony started. She had, in the weeks since the engagement, performed a quiet but comprehensive transformation that she had not announced and that nobody in the family had directly commented on, but that everyone had noticed. She had started asking Clara questions. Not managing questions, not practical questions about the boarding house schedule, but actual questions. What do you want the ceremony to look like? What music do you want? What do you need from me? Clara had answered every one of them carefully and with some disbelief that had taken a week or so to fully resolve into simple gratitude. Josephine sat beside Edith and was beautiful and composed, and held May's hand when May started crying approximately 4 minutes before the ceremony began, which was a full record even for May. Ruth Farley was there. Tom Hatcher and his wife, Birch and his wife, a handful of others who had been genuinely warm rather than performatively warm, which Clara had learned to distinguish between with considerable precision over the previous 6 weeks. Walter Grady was not there. He had not been invited. Everett was at the front of the church when she came down the aisle, and he was looking at her the way he always looked at her, directly, fully, like she was the most worth-looking at thing in the room. And Clara walked toward him with her flowers in her hands, and her mother's careful pinning, holding her hair in place and the blue dress around her. And she did not shake, and she did not hesitate, and she did not look anywhere except forward. She had done enough hesitating. The vows were the traditional ones. Because Clara had thought about writing her own, and had decided that the traditional ones said what needed saying, and anything she added would be for performance, rather than truth. And she was done performing when she said, "I will." She said it the way she said everything that mattered, clearly, without decoration, without leaving any room for misunderstanding. He said it the same way it matched. After the ceremony, outside the church in the October air, Ruth Farley took both of Clara's hands and said, "You look different, do I?" Clara said. "You look like yourself," Ruth said. "Like you finally stopped apologizing for it." Clara thought about that. "I'm practicing," she said. Ruth smiled. "You're doing well." They walked to the ranch house, she and Everett, with the small party of people who mattered, and Everett had arranged food, and there was a fire going, and the piano was in the main room now. Not in the corner, but against the wall with the south-facing window. Exactly where Clara had said she wanted it, positioned to catch the morning light. She had not known he'd moved it. She saw it when she came through the door, and she stopped walking entirely. He had moved it while she wasn't there, while he was setting up the house for the reception. And he had placed it precisely where she described, not approximately, not close enough, but exactly, like he had memorized the conversation. She stood in the doorway of her own house for the first time. Her house. The words settled in her chest in an entirely new way. "You moved it," she said. "Last Tuesday," he said. "When you were at the boarding house." She turned and looked at him. He was watching her, with the expression she had finally named. 3 weeks ago, sitting at the Thursday supper table with his hand in hers. She had said it quietly and directly, the way she said true things. And he had gone very still for a moment before his eyes had done something that was not the controlled, almost smile she'd grown accustomed to, but something wider and more open and entirely undefended. She looked at him now in the doorway of their house. "Thank you," she said. "For the piano, for Tuesday." For all of it, compressed into 2 words she said with everything she had. "Come inside, Mrs. Callahan," he said. She came inside. The evening was warm and good. May played the piano badly and enthusiastically, which was so entirely May that it made Clara laugh with genuine affection. Josephine, who had been quiet and watchful all evening in the way Josephine was quiet and watchful when she was genuinely feeling something she didn't want to perform, found Clara in the kitchen near the end of the night, when Clara was doing what Clara always did at gatherings, managing the cups, refilling things, making sure everyone was comfortable. Stop that, Josephine said. Clara looked at her. I know what you're doing. Josephine took the cup out of her hand. Go sit with your husband. Clara stared at her sister. Clara. Josephine's voice was firm, and there was something behind the firmness that was not irritation but something closer to apology. Slow and genuine, the kind that doesn't announce itself. You spent 15 years taking care of everyone in that house. You are not going to spend your wedding night in the kitchen. She set the cup on the counter. Go. Sit, let someone else worry about the cups for one evening. Clara looked at her sister for a long moment. Josephine looked back. Thank you, Clara said quietly. For more than the cups. For the hair on the night of the first supper. For don't let Mama talk you out of it. For all the small things Josephine had done. Imperfectly and sideways, that had added up over the months to something that looked, in retrospect, like a sister showing up in the only ways she knew how. Josephine waved her hand. Go, she said, and turned to the counter. And Clara went. She found Everett near the piano, talking to Birch about spring fencing. And she came and stood beside him, and he moved automatically. Without interrupting his sentence, without making it a gesture to make room for her, and put his arm at her back. And she stood inside that and thought, this is what it feels like. Not rescue, not being chosen in spite of something. Just being included, being part of the space someone occupies by default. She was going to have to learn how to live like this. She was absolutely willing to do the work. The guests left by 9. Everett closed the door after the last of them and turned around. And they were alone in their house, for the first time actually alone. Not with guests upstairs or sisters down the hall, or a mother who moved through rooms with the specific presence of a woman who has never entirely stopped supervising. Just them. Just this. Clara stood in the middle of the room and looked at the fire and the piano and the table with 2 plates still on it and the lamp burning low in the center. And she felt something, she did not have a clean word, for something that was partly peace and partly the specific exhilaration of standing at the beginning of something, rather than the exhausted middle of it. Are you all right? He said. Yes. She turned. I'm trying to understand that this is real. It's real, he said. I know. She looked around the room. I keep expecting to have something I need to do. He crossed to the table and pulled out her chair. She looked at it. Sit down, Clara, he said gently. Like a man who has had this planned for a while and is finally getting to do it. She sat. He sat across from her, the fire, the lamp. The piano, the 2 plates between them that needed clearing. Nobody cleared them. For the first time in her life, Clara Whitman sat at a table when there was to be done and let the work wait. And the world did not end, and the house did not fall down. And the only thing that happened was that the man across from her reached out and covered her hand with his. And she turned her hand over and held on. I want to tell you something, she said. Tell me. I have been up at 4:47 every morning for 15 years, she said. I don't know if that's going to change. I don't know if I'm capable of sleeping past it. But I want you to know, she looked at him. Whatever I do in the mornings. Whatever old habits come back, the reason I'm up is not because I don't want to be here. It's just, she searched for the right word. It's just who you are, he said. Yes, Clara. He squeezed her hand. You can get up at 3 in the morning and bake 17 biscuits and rewire the porch and fix every fence on this property before sunrise. And as long as you come back inside when you're done, I will consider it a perfect morning. She looked at him. That's very permissive, she said. I'm a permissive man, he said. You're really not, she said. The real one. The wide one she had seen for the first time at the Grange dance when she laughed at the bad dancing. The one she intended to spend the rest of her life occasionally causing. No, he agreed, I'm really not. She smiled back. They sat at the table until the fire burned low, and Clara did not get up once to do a thing that needed doing. And it was the most radical act of her adult life, and she intended to repeat it as often as she could manage. That was the first night. What followed was years. The ranch grew. The way things grow when two capable people put their whole attention toward building something together, not easily. Not without hard seasons and years where the margin was tighter than comfortable. But steadily, Everett's judgment on land and livestock was sound. Clara's judgment on everything else was sounder. Together they made decisions that separately neither of them would have made. Which is how good partnerships work, and they both understood this without either of them needing to be told. The first winter was hard. A cold snap in February that lasted 3 weeks and took 2 of their cattle and damaged the roof over the western corner. And Clara learned what it meant to live on a working ranch in a Montana winter in a way that no amount of imagining had prepared her for. She learned it without complaint, which surprised Everett until he remembered that this was a woman who had been getting up before 5 o'clock in all weather for 15 years. The cold was new. The work was not. "You're not scared," he said one evening. After a particularly brutal day, of the cold, she said. Of any of it. He looked at her. "I thought the first hard season." "I thought you might," he stopped. "Regret it?" she said. "Not regret it. Just find it harder than you'd expected." She looked at him across the table. "Everett," she said, "I spent 15 years doing hard things for a house that wasn't mine. For people who didn't see me. This is hard things for a house that is mine. Next to a person who does." She held his gaze. "There is no version of this that I would trade." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I drove past a boarding house 3 times. She knew what he meant. "I know," she said. "Best decision you ever made." "Yes." "Ma'am," he said, "it was." They had their first child the following September. A girl which Clara had privately wanted and had told no one. Because wanting specific things was still, in the first years of her marriage, occasionally an act of courage. They named her Margaret, after Everett's mother, and called her Maggie, and she came into the world with dark hair like Josephine and gray eyes exactly like Clara's. And when the doctor put her in Clara's arms for the first time, Clara looked down at her and thought with complete clarity, "You will never wonder if you are worth seeing. I will make sure of it." She said that out loud. Everett was beside her, and he heard it, and he put his hand on Clara's hair and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "She's going to know it from both of us. 3 years after Maggie. A boy, Thomas, after Clara's father, the man with the enormous laugh who had believed people were generally trying their best. Tom, they called him, and he had his grandfather's laugh almost from the beginning. The kind that filled rooms, and every time Clara heard it, she felt something bright and bittersweet that was grief and gratitude in equal measure. With 2 children and a growing ranch, and a property that was becoming one of the most respected operations in the county, Clara's days were full in a way that would have looked, from the outside, very similar to the days she had lived at the boarding house. She was up early. She worked hard. She managed more things than any one person should reasonably manage. But the difference that she felt every single day, that she never stopped feeling, that she had decided she was never going to take for granted, was that she did it as herself. Not as the useful one, not as the dependable one, not as the one who was there so everyone else could be somewhere better. As Clara Callahan, who had decided what she wanted and gone and gotten it, who played the piano on Tuesday and Thursday mornings before the household woke up, who still sometimes got up at 4:47 out of pure habit and stood in the kitchen for a moment before she allowed herself to go back to bed, who had learned to ask for help in the specific way that is harder than doing everything yourself directly, without apology, without 30 qualifications to make the asking acceptable. She had learned that from Maggie, actually. Maggie, at 3 years old, had the completely unself-conscious approach to wanting things that Clara had spent her entire childhood having trained out of her. She said, "I want," without preamble. She said, "Help me," without shame. She said, "I'm hungry, and I'm tired," and hold me with the full confidence of a person who has never been taught that her needs are an imposition. Clara watched her daughter do this and felt 2 things simultaneously. The first was gratitude, hot and specific, for Everett. who had made a house where a child could want things out loud without apology. The second was grief quieter, older for the girl she had been, who had learned so early to fold her wanting into something small enough to carry in a pocket where nobody would notice it. She told Everett both of these things. She told him on a Thursday evening, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and she was at the piano, and he was in his chair with the book he claimed to be reading but was mostly using as a prop while he listened to her play. She stopped in the middle of a piece and said, "I was watching Maggie today." "I know," he said. "I watched you watching her." She turned on the bench. "She asks for things without apologizing first." "Yes, I never learned that." She looked at her hands. "I'm trying to learn it now. I thought you should know. In case I'm clumsy at it sometimes." He set down the book. "Clara," he said, "every time you've asked me for something without apologizing first, it has been the best part of my day." She looked at him. "I said I wanted the piano against the south wall," she said. "Best day I had that entire month," he said. She laughed. He smiled. She turned back to the piano and played the piece through to the end, cleanly and completely, without a single wrong note. And when she finished, the silence in the room was the kind that happens after something that has gone exactly right. Maggie was 5 when the thing happened that Clara later thought of as the last piece of the story falling into place, though she understood by then that stories don't actually have last pieces, that they keep going in all directions long after anyone stops watching. It was a Sunday family supper, which had become a fixture of the Callahan Ranch in a way that Clara had not planned but had come to love with a specificity that surprised her. Every Sunday, Edith came, Josephine came, usually with some new complication in her life that she would describe with great animation and expect the table to help her solve. May came with her husband, a gentle, quiet man named Henry, who was exactly right for May, and who had been instantly and thoroughly adopted by Everett into the brotherhood of men who married Whitman women and found themselves cheerfully outnumbered. Clara had cooked, as she often cooked on Sundays, because she still loved cooking, had never stopped loving it. Had only stopped loving the obligation of it, which is a crucial distinction, and she had made too much of everything, which was how she expressed abundance, and the table was full and loud, with the particular noise of a family that has been through enough together to be comfortable. And then old habit came back. It arrived the way old habits do, not dramatically, not with any announcement. Just suddenly, she was up from her chair and reaching for her mother's cup to refill it before Edith had finished asking. And then she was moving toward the kitchen for the extra dish she'd forgotten. And then she was back and reaching for Josephine's plate to pass the bread before Josephine had reached for it herself. And she was halfway through the motion before she heard, not loud, not stern, just absolutely consistent, the sound of Everett's hand resting on the back of her chair. She stopped. She looked at him. Everyone at the table had gone very quiet in the specific way of people who have witnessed something small and significant. "Clara sits first," he said. "Not a reminder." "Exactly. Just a statement of how things were." She stood beside her chair for a moment. Then she sat down. The table resumed. The noise came back. Maggie, who had been watching all of this with the serious, focused attention of a 5-year-old trying to understand a thing she did not yet have words for, looked at her father and said, "Why did you do that?" "Do what?" "Sweet," Everett said. "Make Mama sit down." He looked at his daughter. Then he looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him. And she saw it in his face before he said it, the answer he had. The true one, the one that would become a story in this family for a long time after this evening, passed down eventually to children who had not been born yet. Because, he said, looking at Maggie with the full attention he gave to everything that mattered, "Your mama spent a very long time making sure everyone else was taken care of before she took care of herself. And I made a promise that in this house, that doesn't happen anymore." He paused. "So we wait until your mama sits down, and we're glad to wait. Because without her, there's nothing to sit down to." Maggie processed this. "Because she cooks it?" Maggie said. Because she makes it home, he said. Maggie thought about this seriously. Then she turned to Clara. Mama, she said, you should always sit first. Something in Clara's chest moved. Something that was not a new feeling, she recognized it. Had been recognizing it in varying degrees for 4 years of marriage, but that was this evening, in this particular moment, in its fullest and most complete form. I'm learning, Clara said. I'll help you remember, Maggie said. With the complete seriousness of a 5-year-old, making a genuine commitment. Clara reached out and tucked a piece of dark hair behind her daughter's ear. I know you will, she said. After supper, after the family had gone and the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Clara stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark yard and thought about a morning 15 years ago when she had stood on the other side of a wall and heard her mother say, that's enough for a woman like her. She thought about it the way you think about old injuries, aware of the place, understanding the history of it, but no longer feeling the acute pain. What remained was not bitterness. It was something more useful than that. It was understanding of what she had survived, and what it had cost, and what she had built on the other side of the cost. She heard footsteps behind her. Everett came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He looked out the window with her at whatever she was looking at, which was nothing specific, and everything general, the dark and the stars, and the shape of the mountains, and the fact of being here. In this house, on this land, in this life. I was thinking about something my mother said, she said. A long time ago, before you. He waited. She said, that's enough for a woman like her. She looked at the window. Talking about me, what I could expect. She meant it as I think she meant it, as practical wisdom. Managing my expectations so I wouldn't be hurt. I know, he said. She was wrong, Clara said. Yes, he said. She was, not because I ended up with more than she thought I would. She turned and looked at him. Because the premise was wrong. There's no such thing as a woman like me, with a fixed ceiling on what she's allowed to want. She held his gaze. There's just me and what I want, and whether I'm brave enough to go after it. He looked at her for a long moment. Are you? He said. I went after it, she said. I'm standing in it. He put his arm around her. She leaned into him the way she had learned to lean, not with the gratitude of someone being held up, but with the easy trust of someone who has decided that accepting warmth is not weakness. They stood at the kitchen window. Outside, the Montana night was vast and cold and entirely indifferent to the small warm circle of their house. And inside, the fire was burning, and the piano was against the south wall waiting for morning. And upstairs, 2 children were sleeping, who would wake up tomorrow in a house where their mother sat down first. Every morning, without exception, because the table didn't start until she was in her chair. Because the man who had looked at her and kept looking had understood, before she understood it herself, that she was not the woman in the story who waited at the edge of things. She was the center. She had always been the center. She had just needed someone who knew how to see it, and the courage, finally, when that someone arrived, to believe that what he saw was true. Clara Callahan had spent 29 years being the woman nobody chose. She spent the rest of her life being the woman who chose herself, and that made every difference in the world.